Hello, everyone. This is French, 1920s and 1930s cruiser design and doctrine. This is the Long Patrol. And this is where I try very hard to be polite. And I say that in the most honest way possible. I try very hard to be polite because I have to be respectful of the fact that the French do have a lot of things working against them when it comes to coming up with a coherent policy, doctrine, idea for what they want. They have their infrastructure legacies and technological legacies of the Junicol. They have the huge horrors of World War One. They have the French political establishment. They have the French Navy, higher establishment. And they, of course, have themselves. All of these are big things which they have to overcome. And I do not include that list lightly. I really don't. When I say they have themselves, one of the issues you constantly have is the France in the 1920s and 1930s vacillates between wanting to be a world power and wanting to ignore everything else that's going on in the world. And you can either do one or the other. You cannot try to jump between the two, because you'll end up mucking up both. You'll end up writing checks you don't want to cash. And they're going to bounce. And when they bounce back at you. When I say the admirals are confused, well, there are admirals who are preparing to fight Italy. There are admirals who are preparing to fight Japan. There are admirals who are preparing to fight the case for the Junicol, once again riding forth. And sometimes admirals will be all three in one go. And that's before we get on to the politicians, because whilst you can say they're fairly stable vis-a-vis their higher leadership, i.e. presidents, yes, one is rather short term, and the other three are all comparatively long term. We'll be getting into their governments and their ministers. And then you get into the technological impact of the Junicol. As we've discussed on several occasions, it has an infrastructure legacy. It really does. The Junicol has an infrastructure legacy. You might not want to believe it has. You might think you can snap your fingers and you can make up for years of not investing in stuff, but you can't. In fact, when this comes out in July 2022, there will have recently been a very interesting point made by the current, at this time, Defense Secretary for the United Kingdom, a gentleman called Ben Wallace, MP, who sat down and honestly said, well, for years, every single government has been cutting the things you don't see. The infrastructure, the stocks of weapons, support, has been hollowing out all this stuff, and communications gear, all these things, and in long term, this is stuff which, if you don't have, you can get away with it for a while, because it's not the sexy, flashy stuff which the press will focus on and everyone will see, but it will bite you. It will come back and bite you hard when you get into a war. And I know immediately most people are going, and when this comes out in July 2022, will be going and thinking about Russia and Ukraine. But I couldn't help thinking, listening to that as I was whilst writing and preparing this presentation, that summed up France in the 1920s and 30s in World War II. That summed up the UK, summed up pretty much everyone. There's a lot of things which are being hollowed out to focus on the sexy. And that causes problems. This is a rough description of cruisers. I always use it as a sort of appropriate one because it's to an extent Lord Hill Norton looking back in the 1980s on the 1950s, 60s, and probably 40s. And it's a designation of what the cruiser does, what it's for. Why does all this higher echelon, this infrastructure industry, have an impact on French cruisers? Because your designs are ultimately made based on three things. One, what you can buy. If you are limited to buying domestic, what do you domestically produce that is viable theoretically for this role within plausible deniability terms? Secondly, what you want to do with it, which is defined usually by the higher up. And thirdly, most importantly, how much can you afford to pay? Now, here is the thing. This is where you get into a lot of debates. This one depends on years of infrastructure spending, on consistent procuring, developments, the companies, etc. that evolved in your country. Or you have to buy from abroad. This one depends upon the government above, what kind of view they have of the world. But it also then impacts on this one. Okay, what budget is the government willing to allow the Navy, and how much of the budget of that budget is the Navy willing to spend on the ships? Because one of the interesting debates you often get into people is they're going, well, Britain doesn't have the money in the 1920s and 30s to spend on the Navy. You can see this by how much the Royal Navy is spending. No, the British government, as it's been pointed out by myself, by many other academics, and many learned historians of the era, and of course also my colleague Drakinafel quite regularly and very forcefully, makes a choice about how much money it's spending to pay down the national debt incurred during World War One. It's paying it down at a faster rate than it really needs to. And as it's prioritizing that and other domestic spending, it therefore decides not to spend so much on the Navy. That then leads the Navy to have to make decisions to what best to spend its money on. And that's a whole force assessment. That's not an individual class base. That will be a whole force assessment conducted by the Navy. And this will have repercussions. It's the same with the French. The government is prepared to spend this much on defense funding. Of the defense funding, this much is going to the Navy. Or the Marine Nationale. Of that, how much is the Marine Nationale prepared to spend on cruisers? And this is a big problem. Again, with France, they're always more prepared to spend money on stuff which they can build domestically. In France, this should mean all the turbines come from the Rateau Bretagne turbine systems, courtesy of Auguste Rateau. A very good engineer, a very good salesman, a very patriotic Frenchman. However, very quickly, when you start to look through their list of cruisers, it gets very interesting because this name crops up rather a lot for a nation which is supposedly focused on domestic. Parsons. And at certain points, even when you're looking at turbines which are theoretically produced by this company, it seems the blades, etc., and other parts of the turbine have come from other sources. Now, this is not unusual. This is quite standard modern practice. Most ships, most vehicles these days are what you call battlefield hot rods in terms of their countries of origins. There are very few vehicles these days operating, or ships, which are the products of a sole country in terms of their sourcing of equipment. It's a reality the French have to put in. And it's a reality which is compounded by the fact that despite them only building 11 light cruisers and 7 heavy cruisers, in part because they have a lovely smattering of pre-World War One and World War One light cruisers from their own production, and some German pre and World War One light cruisers to make up their force. They do spread their production rather haphazardly round 5 yards. Potentially a sixth as well is also included, but we'll put that to one side. The Arsenal de Lorient gets some waters. And the Arsenal de Lorient is an interesting place. It was founded in 1666, literally 1666, by the French East India Company, and has been in some form of what you could call civilian military, I suppose, with the East Indian Company, to military use ever since. It's even still construction to this day. It also built the Couronne, the first ironclad frigate, which with an integral French iron hull, is launched there. Following in the footsteps of the first armoured frigate, the Gloire, which the French are really quite proud of, and of course was designed by Henry Dopé de l'Homme, who was a native of Palma. The French are right to be proud of Gloire. The fact that the French started off and then the British just produced something which outclassed it completely in the Warrior is a classic example of the British having the infrastructure investment which the French don't. The French get there first. Ideally, the Gloire should have been the French dreadnought moment, when they reset the world's tables and they could take off a pace. But they don't have the infrastructure, they don't have the consistent funding, they can't do that. So it doesn't happen, and the British maintain their lead, for want of a better word. Cruelly, but they do. Infrastructure, it matters. Lorient is not the only yard that's so used. There is also the Brest. Now, the Arsenal of Brest is another interesting one. It's again an old one, a critical one. There have been facilities there in use since 1631. So it's 35 years roughly older than Lorient. The powder magazines, the colliery, military hospital were all operational by 1674. Trullan Dock was built in 1683. The Pontonnier docks and other naval structures created in 1746. It is an absolutely critical place. It's also where the armoured cruiser, the Dupé de l'Homme, is built there in 1895. The battleships Charles Martel in 1897, Charlemagne in 1899, Arena in 1902, Republic in 1906, and Démocrate in 1908. Plus Leon Gambetta and Edgar Quinet in 1905 and 1911. It's also where other slightly less interesting ships have been built there, including the French aircraft carrier Clemenceau in 1961. I keep talking about yards lately with cruiser construction, but also build aircraft carriers. I can't think why. It's almost as if the two go hand in hand. And then we have the Société Nouvelle des Forges et Chantiers de la Méditerranée, which is an interesting organization. It really is. It has shipyards in La Seine-sur-Mer near Toulon, and also in Greville near Le Havre. They are mainly a builder of ships of cruisers for the foreign markets. They seem to build quite a lot for the Japanese and the Russians. They provided, along with Vickers, a rather large contingent of the vessels fighting in the Russo-Japanese War. One of the interesting things you find about this yard is that they pretty much start to focus in on almost liner production at one point in the 1920s and early 1930s, and then the Montcalm, this vessel, is built there. French cruiser, La Graciani class, which is a lovely vessel. They'd also built the Bairn. This is not the yard, though, which was famously pressured into building a cruiser despite becoming practically a liner specialist. But it is kind of an interesting scenario that a yard which has built that, despite its prestigious history, is then brought back to build that. There's a mild difference between the two going on. Just a mild one. And then we get Ateliers et Chantiers de Loire, workshops and shipyards of the Loire. Now, this yard is special. This yard is part of a battleship race, really. It's one of the ones which is critical to, especially in Saint-Nazaire, critical to construction of the ships that the French Navy will need for World War One, and especially when they're trying to rebuild themselves after the Junicole experiment. They also like to build ocean liners and naval aviation and various other things. They re-enter the battleship market prior to World War II. They built 2 of France's 4 battleships. They had contracts for another and for 2 aircraft carriers. This is the yard which the French were relying on to build their aircraft carriers. Strange enough, they didn't go back to the yard which had built the Bern. Can't think why. But this was going to build the new French Navy. And it's interesting to look at the plans for the French Navy and the concepts that were coming up. What you realize very quickly is that there is a deep schism going on there. Once you start to try and marry up the French Navy, I do wonder if the carriers had been built, if they would have healed the schism. Because they're the only platform that looks to me able of marrying up the two disagreeing strategies and theories and actually making the different components work together. I don't see how Bern could do that. But it's interesting to see that this basically all of these yards are involved in production. All these yards get cruisers, and yet really this yard is the closest thing that the French have to a capital ship, a carrier specialist. And if you can argue the cruiser serves to help warm up their production facilities, but also there's an argument that the cruiser distracts them from what they should be focusing on, because this is the only yard you've got that can churn out your large capital ships and carriers, and your ships are far larger. Why are you sending a light cruiser to it? Is it because you don't have any other options? Is it because you're trying to crash build cruisers because you realize years of vacillation and problematic thinking in terms of constantly seeing the problems of everything and the value of nothing have put you in a bad scenario? I can't honestly answer that. I have read a number of books on the French policy. I have read a number of translated papers. I have even tried with my very limited French that I stopped learning at, and I'm always open about this, I stopped learning French at about the age of 13, 14, when my school decided that because of dyslexia, obviously I had enough trouble with English, so therefore I would advise strongly not to take foreign languages for my GCSEs. At the time, I didn't mind because it got me allowed me to pick up an extra humanities and an extra practical subject, as I considered it, because I did both IT and DT. For those who don't know the UK system, it's information technology, i.e. computers, and DT, design and technology, i.e. workshop. And Forges et Chantiers de la Grande. Now, this is a very interesting yard. Hello. We've got a visitor. It's the sort of yard which you would expect to be submarine specialists. They specialize in small boats, far more likely the French version of the sloop, basically, the aviosos. They do a lot of those. And you wonder sort of why are they suddenly given a cruiser. Now, there are, again, a couple of options for why you give them a cruiser. One, to keep open the yard facilities for cruiser-sized vessels. That's always a legitimate reason to give them a cruiser. Two, you need the political support in the region, and let's be honest, an avioso is not going to get you the political support because it's just too small. It's not sexy enough. It might carry guns, but it's basically a sloop. And the final option, and this would be me being really cynical, you're trying to maintain facilities open in case you need them in wartime, and you don't want to pay them for nothing, so you have them build a cruiser so they keep those facilities going, so if you need them in wartime, they're available. Very cynical of me to suggest that, isn't it? You okay, Tafra? You looking forward to your upgrade meeting? Good. Right. Having the upgrade meeting on the weekend. This will come out on Saturday. You're here on Sunday. Whether he's been promoted to assistant, fluffy research assistant, or if he's staying as trainee assistant, fluffy research assistant for the foreseeable future. High pressure times. So, here are the admirals. And there is part of me which feels sorry for them, but there is also part of me which feels, oh my lord, what did you do? You have between Pierre-Alexis Ronac and, as far away as I can stick it from me, Francois Delanne, you have these officers. You have the gentleman under Delanne, Henry Salon, turns up twice. You have Maurice Grasset, who is the gentleman in the middle. You have Villette, who sort of designed the periscope. And you have Georges Durand-Viel, who manages the longest in post of 5 years, 318 days, and God knows how many ministers. Now, I am saying this as honestly as I can, because these officers spend a lot of time in service. They do their best for duty for France. One of them gets, in between his two terms, the gentleman, below Delanne, Saloon, gets very close to 4.5 years of service. It's worthwhile thinking that in total. So, they're all trying. The average for most is 3 and a bit years. Pierre-Alexis Ronac manages 294 days, but that's also measured in 2 ministers. For most of these officers, they had to balance their own internal issues as well as their external political issues. Internal issues were a large number of their navy thinking that because the treaty mean we cannot build capital ships, the Junacol will rise again. All hail the Junacol! All hail the Junacol! All hail the Junacol! While a vast majority of the officers are going, quiet. Now, if you are going to try and argue against this, I would point out that one of the cruisers I'm going to be discussing in a bit as part of this is actually named for a naval architect who was famous for his work with the Junacol. Here is the thing. My dad built goodness knows how many ships for the Royal Navy. He's never going to get a ship named after him. Brunel, no ship named after him. D.K. Brown. No ship named after him. Honestly, to get even the last two, who have got some legitimate fame, Brunel a lot of fame, to their names, get ships named after them for the Royal Navy that are warships, a warship named after them. You're not climbing on the table. The Royal Navy would have to be some sort of spacefaring navy, which is now about 1 million ships strong. I mean, there are so many other names they would come first before they'd even consider getting to naming ships for naval architects. For starters, HMS Corgi. No, HMS Zebedee probably comes before a ship named for a naval architect. So that's what the admirals are dealing with, but also they're trying to manage up. And as you might have noticed that I mentioned ministers earlier. So before we start talking about the 4 presidents who are mentioned here, it's worthwhile pointing out this little bit of thing I've put down in a little bit of writing. Between November 1918 and September 1939, there were 30 cabinets. 19 different people served as prime minister, but 30 cabinets. The average length being 8 months and 10 days. Now, sometimes during those cabinets, they would have multiple Navy ministers. Multiple. There is literally a scenario, I think, with at least 2 of these admirals, where they walked in on Monday, met a new minister, said, "Hello, minister." The minister probably said, "Hello, Admiral. My name is da-da-da-da. We will have a long and wonderful relationship." Which they respond, "Yes, minister." And then by a Wednesday, when they walk in for their next meeting with the Navy minister, they go, "Hello, minister." Minister goes, "Hello, Admiral. My name is da-da-da-da. We will have a long relationship." "Yes, minister." Well, Friday goes in for another meeting and goes, "Yeah, hello, minister." "Hello, Admiral. We will have a long and wonderful relationship." "Yes, minister." So beneath them, the admirals are trying to balance Italy being Italy at this point, which will get on to the sartorial eminence of Il Duce in a bit. You have Japan being increasingly Japan. You have the rise of the Junacol again. And then they have this next level, and then they have the presidents. And the presidents are nice, you know, they're lovely people, but let's talk about them for a little bit. The presidents of France. They are, in order, Alexander Millerand. A very nice gentleman and a scholar, but also someone who is an independent in terms of political leanings, and increasingly described as an independent socialist drawn to the right. He spends most of his time trying to fight internal class struggles and doesn't really whenever he does think about foreign policy, it's usually to tighten the screws further on these evil Germans, not thinking about anyone else. Gaston de Mergo could have been interesting. 7 years in post, radical socialist and radical Republican Party. First Protestant president of France. Again, very much focused on Germany and its resurgent nationalism. He also has fun. Let's put it this way. In the nicest way I've seen written, this was written in Wikipedia, where they put it a phrase as ministerial discontinuity. What most people describe it as, every ministerial post and most of his prime ministers are a revolving door of, oh, who are you? Who are you? Who are you? Who are you? This is 1924 to 1931. Then a gentleman called Paul Demer. Unfortunately, he is shot after 329 days in post. Independent, but could have been good. We'll never know. And then comes Albert Lebrun, who's in post 8 years and 32 days until, well, the 11th of July 1940, when he de facto ceases to have any influence on events. None of these men are what you would call long-term strategic thinkers. And I know that was a long pause there. I do try and work on them. But they're not really long-term strategic thinkers when it comes to defense and security. In terms of what they're dealing with, they're focusing very much on what's in front of them. And what's in front of them is a strategic mess. Honestly, that is what they have in front of them, because each one deals with the issues created by prime ministers, the budgets, all the various things going through. Every time you have a new prime minister, a new cabinet, they have a new budget emphasis. Every time the prime minister has a fight with people in his cabinet, and they are all him at this precise time, they rearrange their cabinet, and they've got new ministers running the departments. And it's a case of, oh, my lord, who is actually in charge of what? I don't know. I mean, honestly, the French governments in this period would make most modern political organizations and the governments, with their occasional revolving door of personalities, seem positively long-term and stable. So let's go to this. What have we got the French? Well, as you notice, in the Mediterranean, mostly they're going to be fighting, if they're fighting anything, is a defensive war. They've got a lot of supplies in Algeria and Morocco, and there is always the advantage that they can technically bring stuff overland from Morocco and from the Atlantic to Algeria. So they don't have the same problems that the Italians might have with protecting Libya. And Italy is the main problem in the Mediterranean. They also have the fact that most of the major French ports are on the North Atlantic, are on their sort of their Channel Atlantic coast. So they can afford to fight defensive until they've accomplished their initial reinforcements, and then they can go offensive. Now, you're probably going to go, hang on, but they're cut off from Syria, which is their mandate, which they've been given after the World War I, and surely they need to defend that. Yes, but you have to remember what is strategically next to it. Palestine and Iraq, British mandates, and a large British base in Malta, where most of the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean lives at this time. And the British also have a base in Alexandria. So whilst they might in a one-on-one versus the Italians not enter a war, you can also guarantee the Italian fleet is not going to be getting past Gibraltar anytime soon, and they might not want to go that much into the eastern Mediterranean for fear of upsetting the British. The British would prefer not to have any issues being mucked around with in terms of the mandates. So yes, there might be raids, but an actual massive assault going that direction would cause trouble for the British, and the Italians surely should be sensible enough not to want to do that as well. So the Mediterranean is likely to be high-speed battles fought in the Western Mediterranean, and this will either be the extreme western, the western basin of the Western Mediterranean, which is to this side of Sardinia and Corsica and these islands, in which case it will be under French air cover, most likely, especially as time goes on and aircraft get longer ranged, or it will be in the eastern basin of the eastern part of the West, in which case, well, it's going to be surrounded mostly by Italy under their air cover, which is why high-speed, strong air defenses are sort of something which the French have to think about in terms of their ships. And they do think this all through. Now, the French Empire, the Far East. The Far East is another strategic issue for the French because, well, they have a small problem. Who are they going to defend their Far East Empire against? In fact, their whole global empire against? Is it going to be Britain and America? No, because if either of those want it, they got it. They are the two largest navies on paper in the world at this time. The two most powerful groups of allies. The Americans are allowed a huge navy on paper. They're not building it up to that, but they do have it. They are allowed it. The British are allowed a huge navy on paper. Them and their Commonwealth powers are building it, and they have bases all around the world to support that navy. Okay, so if they want to do it, they can. There's no chance of France winning that. So there's no point working out to fight that one because you're not going to fight it. Okay, what about Japan? Well, is France going to have to fight a war against Japan if they attack her alone? No. In fact, it'll probably be a race between Britain and America to see which one will join their side first, because you have to remember for both those powers, there is the significant risk that if they don't join and the other one successfully leads an alliance of European nations, etc., to humble Japan, they lose their position in the Far East. So, for both America and Britain, if Japan attacks anyone, they both have to join the war to fight them, because otherwise they lose their position of prominence in the Far East and Pacific. It's a catch-22 for those powers. So what does France want to be? Well, if France wants to retain their territories afterwards and not get looked down on, they need to be able to provide a significant force enabler. Now, this is one of the interesting things which leads to a whole sort of discussion over what exactly the French are building their capital ships for, because the amount of people who turn around and go, they're being designed to hunt the Deutschland class. Not really. Okay, being fast enough to hunt down the Deutschland class, A, doesn't make you a battle cruiser, because the Deutschland class in practice are not that fast. They have a nice theoretical speed, but that's not brilliant. They have a practical speed, and most people know what that is at this time. They are long-range surface raiders, yes, but being designed to hunt them down just means you're fast on average, but you're a fast capital ship. You don't have to be a battle cruiser to do that. What you do want to be, though, is fast enough you can be useful to either the British or the Americans, and most likely to the British. Why do I say this most likely to the British? Because the French have the same problems as the British if they're fighting a Pacific War. Why would they go across the Atlantic, through the Panama Canal, and then across the Pacific to get to Japan? They have bases like the British do in the Caribbean and on the way. So you can say, well, that's why they should do. But that's a very long way to go round and very unsupported. Whereas, where's sensible for them to go? Through the Mediterranean, through the Indian Ocean, and up the South China Sea, East China Sea, into Japan that way. If you notice, there's all the French Indochina, which of course is modern Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. If you have all of those, why would you go the other way around? So nice way, you're probably going to be joining the British force. What do the British probably want you to do? Well, if you can provide a fast strike group that can be used as a surface hunter group for hunting surface raiders, they would love that. But also, in a war against Japan, they're going to need extra ships, especially on the pulse, because the wider battle fleet will come up. But remember, that's going to be constrained by the speed of the R-class, the Queen Elizabeths, and Nelson and Rodney. So if you can get out there with a small force early on to back up the reaction force from the Mediterranean, you're going to be very useful to them, which is going to give you a stronger seat at the table. Same with the Atlantic. In any war against Germany, when that eventually comes up, because let's remember, Japan comes out of World War One, they have a very different approach to what happened after World War One. Then Italy turns fascist in 1922. Those are long-running issues. Germany, let's be honest, that's sort of a recipe of the French's own creating. Millerand, Dumouriez, and to an extent Lebrun, mostly though Millerand and Dumouriez, have been quite Dumouriez. Sorry, there's Dumouriez and Dumouriez. We're sort of making sure you know which one is which. I know I'm mispronouncing Dumouriez's name, but it's to make sure it's obvious who's who. They are so anti-German and so obsessed with German militarism, they do not reinforce and give the Weimar Republic any support. And that's part of the reasons why the Weimar Republic ends up falling and Germany falls to militarism. That's fun. In which case, the Atlantic becomes part of it. And again, what's useful for the British? Another surface raid hunter group. The British will provide most of them, but another one will ease the pressure on the British. It's something which the British can rely on as an extra bit, especially in the Atlantic. It's going to be useful. And this is something you have to remember again. The French Navy and the Royal Navy throughout this period work hand in glove. They are operating together and thinking together on such regular occasions. You could argue the French Navy is almost as close to the Royal Navy as some of the Commonwealth navies are. Despite this, the Royal Navy still doesn't share with them most of their secrets of night fighting and various other things because, national interests and they're still the French. But, yeah. Goes towards explaining some of the things that happen in World War II. In that the Royal Navy and the British government are quite so shocked by, A, the change around in France of their leadership's position and the politicians' position, but also the Navy's change around. And the people who they've been dealing with for years, the Navy disappear, and they're dealing with different people who don't behave the way they used to behave, and they're confused by this, and they don't understand this, and they don't understand what's going on, and they don't have any trust, and because of that, and that leads to issues. It's basically, you have to remember, they have almost a decade of planning and working together, and then a few months of war, and up to from 8 weeks before, when they are shipping gold to Canada to save it so that they can keep fighting a war, to then 4 weeks later they are saying something very different, and then 4 weeks by the time it's 4 weeks after that they've abandoned the war. It's kind of a case of what the frick happened. Fascist Italy is, of course, a part of their equation, so from 1922. This is something that you always have to consider. All the fascist dictatorships are basically come to power because of agreements with elites. And because elites see the fascisti as a way of protecting themselves against communism. This is very true in Italy. This is true in Germany. This is even true in Spain, where I would argue that Franco, as a representative elites, adopts fascism as a way to get support to win it. It's more of an external outlooking adoption of fascism rather than a adherent belief necessarily. However, of all the fascist dictatorships, the only one who is sartorially obsessed is this particular infantryman. And again, there is something about the fascist dictators who are all these sort of infantrymen who, in naval terms, are obsessed with big, fast ships with big guns. Don't know what it is. Anyway, Mussolini has costumes for every occasion. He has his infantry uniform, which was from a fairly respected unit of infantry, to the suit he puts on when he's negotiating treaties with the Vatican over Rome, to the brilliant white uniform he wears when he's talking to the young black shirts at a summer camp. I'm sorry, why do you go to these summer camps? I suppose it was something they used to do, but there are lovely things to do in a summer. Why would you want to go off and spend the entire time discussing politics? Because if you're going away to a summer camp with an organization that's political, no matter what you're doing, you're going to spend your time discussing politics. And that's just a way to ruin a sunny afternoon. And he has his, what I call his dictator outfit of very flashy boots, hat, and garb. Anyway, Fascisti Italy, Mare Nostrum, the people who are obsessed with recreating the Roman Empire. Your next door neighbours. You're going to think about that. You're going to get into a bit of a speed race for your ships. And there are many people who like to try and focus on French ships and go, they're built in response to this of Nazi Germany. Notice that. You always have to remember, any capital ship that France builds has to also match up against Italy's capital ships. Because if they don't, they're going to be in trouble because, let's be honest, Italy always has more capital ships than Germany. And Italy is right next door and really annoying. Whereas if you consider the German Navy, for them to get to the France, they have to go past, hello, one of the largest navies in the world. Hello. Hello. We're feeling very hello and welcoming today. Japan. Japan is Japan in the 1920s and 30s. At the same time as they are building this, I don't know, monument to democracy that is the Japanese Diet, the parliamentary building, which apparently I've not managed to put, despite this being the 6th recording, it's the first time I've noticed that there is no bracket after building. I do apologize. They're doing that, but at the same time, Lieutenant General and Baron Asada Araki is an army minister and education minister in the Kano cabinet, and he is, frankly, reading some of his writings really does make for mental logic jumps. I've actually had this conversation with a friend of mine who is Japanese because I wondered if I couldn't understand his writing and wasn't getting the translations because I didn't have enough knowledge of the culture and I couldn't, in a nice way, think within the culture. I was still from the outside. And no, he agrees with me. Some of his writing does have tremendous logical jumps and twists. Japan was, of course, making itself its own lovely empire. And is something which France has to consider because if you look at it, you'll notice whilst the British and others have isolated territories, Hong Kong, Weihai Wei, etc., in China, France has quite a lot of stuff bordering on China. Quite a lot of stuff. And it's sort of a case of please don't come after our stuff. And you, of course, have Emperor Hirohito, Showa, a period. This is in Fromen in 1928, and he sort of epitomizes the Japanese scenario because he's theoretically at the same time as being all powerful, pretty much powerless. It's kind of like you have the Diet, you have all the Japanese politicians getting together, they have all these powers, but the Constitution means that the military has a weird whip hand, a really weird one. And you also have them killing each other, and it's just a case of what's happened here? And then Germany. Germany, we have the Weimar Republic, which is one of the most liberal states you can possibly imagine. And is sometimes held up by colleagues who go, this is a case. This is a case of a state which liberalized too fast for its population, and therefore it was too liberal. I don't really agree with that. No matter what your political beliefs, I think it's often whenever you find that you are trying to introduce something and you are not getting popular support and you're not taking the population with you, it's a problem which comes down to one of three things. It's a failure of communication, it's a failure of understanding, or it's a failure of timing. I would say with the Weimar Republic, it's a failure of communication and to an extent of timing, because they are always saddled with this idea of being the stabbers in the back, of being the people who had desecrated Germany's military honor, when Germany had no chance of winning World War One. And so, with all that, we have the rise of another of those uniformed aficionados, Hitler. The Weimar Republic, yeah, it fails to communicate. It doesn't really, how do I put this? It doesn't have the understanding it needs abroad in order to support it of the situation of what's going on in Germany. Mostly because Germany, other countries are focusing on their own national interest themselves, which is fine. It's what I elected to do. But you also need a bit of enlightened self-interest at certain points, and you need to look at and go, inviting Weimar Republic into things like the Naval Treaty, especially in 1931, could have done tremendous things to shore them up when they were going through the economic crises that came about because of the Wall Street crash, etc., in terms of dealing with some of their militaristic elements and their heavily conservative elements, in terms of making them buy into the process, because they would see a benefit of maintaining the Weimar Republic in terms of their acceptability around the world. Also would have given them a nice construction program of a couple of battleships or something, which could have been useful for economic reasons, but we'll leave that to one side. So you get the rise of Germany. Now, this is normally the point at which you start to get issues. And one of the reasons why it comes up so often that things like the French cruisers or the French capital ships are built to hunt down German surface raiders is because this stuff comes about and starts getting mentioned in the 1930s, late 1930s, 1937, 38, as a way of trying to deter conflict. Basically, it's the modern equivalent of us, I don't know, the US Navy, if they said, our SM-3 anti-ballistic missile could shoot down a DF-21 or something like that. It's what you do when you're trying to. It's one of the last phases before trying to deter a major conflict. You make direct points. I'm going to say one thing. The just depressing that it comes about in the first place, honestly. But no, what's even more depressing is at least, none of them have any redeeming features. but only Mussolini is a close horse of the fascist dictators. As I'm trying to remember. I can't remember any obsession of sartorial elegance beyond his uniform and normal neatness being attached to Franco. Hitler was definitely no sartorial focus personality, despite being an artist. Mussolini was the one who was basically obsessed with fashion. So, the legacy of the Juno Cole. Well, meet the Emile Bertin, which, with its 3 triple turrets, 6-inch guns, focusing it's the leader on the Atlantic Ocean of the Fantastique and other classes of fast destroyers. It's a lovely ship, but it's named for Louis-Émile Bertin. It's named for a naval architect who, whilst he did build a battleship and a couple of armored cruisers, was known as being a forthright advocate for the Juno Cole. A very forthright advocate. And the really interesting thing for the French, and the really interesting thing for their entire strategy, is that it takes so long for the Juno Cole lobby to come round to the idea that the aircraft carrier might actually be the best thing since sliced bread. Because let's be honest, at its core point, the Juno Cole is about using small, cheap, easily replaceable things to take out your opponent's big, expensive thing. It's a cost offset strategy. Define aircraft in the 1920s. I can argue that it was because of the burn, that they were quite so slow in getting around to this. You could argue it's their unique strategic scenario, but honestly, under all of this, they needed it. Aircraft carrier would have probably been a very good thing. It could have been quite a useful thing to have built before they built the capital ships, because they could build one, and they could have used that to actually warm up the yards rather than a cruiser to building large ships. Build an aircraft carrier. It's going to take up pretty much the same space as a capital ship, so you can test out the yard size. Test out the issues of the yard. Test out, do you need to expand the yard? Admittedly, that all requires a significant degree of funding, investment, and an actual long-term view, and probably requires a prime minister to be in post for more than an average of 8 months, and probably requires whichever minister they have in charge of the navy to be in post for more than 4 minutes. I'm not getting into the number of navy ministers, but here is the ultimate problem for France. Yes, they can fund the navy. Yes, they could invest in infrastructure and they could build up a very strong navy. But you have a generation of leaders who do not want to invest in war, as they hope war won't happen again. You have a generation of leaders who are from mostly the wings of the political parties who distrust the military and are worried about a coup, especially the rise of the fascist power, so they don't want to invest in them in case they give them too much money and power. You have land borders with Italy and Germany, which are far bigger and far bigger problems. And if you want a classic example of the French strategic issues, okay, look down at the Italian border. It goes the right way along, but stops at Switzerland. Okay? The spaces where there aren't much fortifications, aren't anything in the way of fortifications, are places where there are mountains quite so big that, frankly, no one's getting through in a bazillion years, so no one really minds. However, we go up to the border with Germany. Okay, we have fortifications, then get to Belgium. Now, here is your problem. If you build fortifications along the border with Belgium, You are sacrificing them to Germany. But you're also making the point that attacking through Belgium would not be a sensible thing because it's not going to get you anywhere other than Belgium. France is now secure and safe. However, then you're sacrificing Belgium, which is bad because they're your fellow Francophone nation. Okay? So, then you don't build your fortifications and you try and get the Belgians to build the fortifications and to fortify their border. Okay, now your defense is dependent upon a smaller nation having the cash to spend on huge fortifications like you just spent on in order to secure your border. That doesn't tend to work out that well, and it didn't work out that well. Also, that depends on them having a long-term consistent plan which fits with yours. If you have any strategic divergence, you end up with what you do have, which is nothing. So, have you ultimately wasted a lot of money building this stuff? Yep. You have. Because ultimately, no one wanted to take the very tough decision of the Belgian border. They kept punting it down the road, hoping someone else would make it. They kept punting the decision down the road, hoping someone else would make it or the situation would get better. And to be honest, you could say, whilst there was the Weimar Republic, they were probably fine to do that. They needed the defense in name only. The Germany of Weimar Republic was never going to be a threat to them. It didn't have that kind of style of government. It was never going to be aggressive. In which case, a good long-term plan might have been to do everything you can to prop up and maintain the Weimar Republic. Oh. They didn't do that either. So the Navy is simply something being built overall as a method of securing colonial assets in peacetime with presence, and in wartime providing a key group to your allies in terms of a wider global war, but potentially having to fight a Mediterranean war solo. So your main potential enemy you have to build the fight, arguably, it's not the Germans, it's the Italians. If Seinfeld fighting the Germans solo, something's gone wrong. But also, hopefully, they haven't invaded Belgium. If you're fighting solo, yeah, in which case it's stalemate on your concrete. Or they might try and invade Switzerland, but that's not really a good idea. Invading Switzerland is never a good scenario. It's one of the things, and I have to say this is, I had fun. I met someone who's very, very on the EU side of the current EU Swiss debate going on, and they're basically going, yes, Switzerland is going to have to, in the end, they're going to have to accept to be part of, do what we want to do and be part of the European Union and do the things we want to do in the way we want to do them. I'm sitting there going, you have never met the Swiss, have you? If you can meet a more stubborn, in a good way, in that they are very, very ardently Swiss, and they will be Swiss first, foremost, and evermost. It's when people go, yes, Nazi Germany could have invaded, and Mussolini's Italy could have invaded Switzerland and occupied them in World War II. That would have been a good way to lose a lot of troops. They would put up one of resistance. And those mountains and valleys would turn into absolute words which you cannot say on YouTube for fear of upsetting people. Mainly YouTube. Swiss are just as strong and proud today. So the ships overall, they are built by the French, though, and getting back to this, they are built by the French as part of their wider strategic consideration. But they also all have this problem in that you have this lurching from Far East, Mediterranean, Je ne colle! And sometimes trying to do all three at once, and the ship's Crozier, the Premier class, the Crozier de Premier class, the the 8-inch cruisers, because I'm not going to call these heavy cruisers, because even Alderie, which is the closest the French come to a heavy cruiser, is not of the treaty era, is not a heavy cruiser. It is a Crozier de Premier class. It is a first class cruiser. They are built. They are basically like, they are all light cruisers. These are the 8-inch light cruisers. And they are built for a speed, a mobility of warfare. They are built for a presence. And they are built with elegance and lines. And I can have a lot of respect for these ships if I do not think of them as heavy cruisers. If I try to think of them as heavy cruisers, there is zero chance I want to be near any of them. But as first class cruisers, as large light cruisers, as cruisers which are orientated around fighting dashing raids, probably providing protection on and riding herd on convoys and fast convoys running from the French Mediterranean bases to Algiers and back, or escorting convoys around the world, or making a dash with the capital ships to the Far East, reinforcing the first reinforcements of the British getting out into the Far East, probably going to the same fuel dumps, the same fuel points as the British fleet en route to fill up, and turning up in Singapore, steaming in online with probably Renown, Repulse, and Hood and that sort of force, sailing in. We're here. The European naval power is here, and then working on pushing up, seeing how far they can get up before they need to wait for the main fleet to arrive to help them push on. Yeah, I can see them being part of that. Which is where I think their sort of design is interesting, because the French never point go, we've got to cram as many guns as we can on these ships. At every point, they realize presence matters. At certain points, they do put some weird structures on their ships, but they develop a French style. And it has an elegance. It has a degree of armor. And it has these... It sort of goes from 8 gun to 9 guns. And I like it. I like their style of hull. I like their style of... Well, I like their style of design. Their heavy cruisers, they are, to an extent, the French counties, but they are made to be the French, what the French need, rather than the county, which is what the British need. What's interesting, again, is they are armed with the model 1924 guns, most of them. And the modern 1924 guns are known to be simplistic in design, but also the simplistic construction of them really gives them a very firm framework for use. It's one of the things when you realize that the French are in many ways designing around their infrastructure and industrial capabilities. Even in 1920s, they know their industry hasn't yet caught up with the likes of Vickers, with the likes of some of the American gun manufacturers. They haven't yet got there. But they want to produce an effective gun. And they look at it and they go, where can we simplify? Where do we have to specialize in this term design? And it's a auto-fretted A-tube with a shrunk jacket and a breech ring. The gun is technically 203 millimeters, not 8 inches. So that's technically 7.9 something inches. It's a very good weapon. And it's a very useful weapon. They are modified. Trust me. There is a debate as to whether this has the same generation of guns as this. There is no doubt in my mind that the generation of guns between this and this are different, despite what they might say. Because there are some interesting developments at the foundry, and I wouldn't be surprised if the metallurgy is a little different, to say the least. But this is 4 of the 7 heavy cruisers. Or, sorry, Croiseur de Premier class, 8-inch light cruisers. French light cruisers have, or rather, the French Croisier, the secondary class, they have an even more interesting time because the French have these German ships which are very capable. And that starts out of the basis of their force, and they have to work out what they're going to use these cruisers for, what their exact role is going to be, and that is a complicated assessment. You know, I've been doing separate videos on the French, well, the Marine Nationale's mine-laying vessels, which are another group of these are ships. And the French really have a philosophy that goes into these ships. And what you start to realize quite quickly when you start to really look at these ships is because of the secondary class. In a war against Japan or Atlantic War, they become defensive task force assets. And because of the Premier class and the capital ships take the lead. They're going to form the basis of the hunting groups. They're going to form the basis of the pulse group to go out to the Far East. That's what they are, and the rest are going to be grouped around them. In a Mediterranean war, it's these vessels which will take the lead, and the others which will enforce. And when you start to look at that as the different strategies of the two, you start to see that these are orientated in many ways around taking the lead under that scenario. And they're orientated very much for the Mediterranean campaign, I would argue. They have beautiful bows for going in the Atlantic and all these things, yes. But that's an essential, sensible thing, because you can take an Atlantic bow into the Mediterranean, a Mediterranean bow in the Atlantic is going to be a problem. It's sensible. But again, you have these 8-9 gun ships, you have the development of the hull, and you have the fact that this ship, this lovely ship, the Emile Bertin, sits there. And it is built between 1931 and 35. It takes 4 years. 4 years. Laid down August 1931, launched May 1933, commissioned January 1935. That is a long time for a light cruiser to be being worked on. That is a long time for a 6-inch gun light cruiser to be worked on. And that is ultimately the problem with the French industry. And it's the other issue with them is that if you consider that this has Parsons steam turbines. So the ship which is named for the French naval architects, the Junecolle, the ship which becomes the basis of future cruiser production this period, is powered by Parsons turbines. And it starts off with they are trying to put in the French ones. They realize they're not going to get what they need. Then they have to redesign the ship and put in the Parsons ones. as I read it. And I would say as I read it. If we go back to quickly to this slide here. This slide, I have 3 wonderful books pictured. 2 of them are by John Jordan and his colleague, The French Battleships and the French Cruisers. I highly recommend these books. I highly recommend this book, which is Robert's French Warships in the Age of Steam, 1859 to 1914. These are exceptional books and have formed the basis, along with Jordan's treaty books, for me to start off this approach. They have me where I've ended. I have gone into a lot of journal articles. I have gone everywhere I can to try and build this as thoroughly as I can for you all. But they were definitely the starting points, and they were very good starting points to have. I don't agree with everything in them, but there again, if, as I often tell people, if you find a historian who agrees 100% with what another historian has said, then either they haven't read anything on the topic and they're just mouthing words, or they are lying. There's the fact that me, Drac, and Jamie Seedale of Armored Carriers work together as often as we do. There is a very large list of things we do not agree on in terms of why something happened or what it's for. We're all good friends. We would defend each other's right to be wrong 100% of the time, because that's what friends do. But we would still say we don't agree with it. We just don't agree with them being shut out, with each other being shut down when they say it. There are also lots of things we agree on, but that's how friendship works and how being historians works. So the summary. It's the Junicole. Honestly, this has a massive legacy, and the question for today that I'm going to leave you all with is, does the Junicole still have a legacy today in construction? Are there ships and navies you see to this day which are still being built around and entirely around the concepts of the Junicole? I'm not talking about the balanced strategy which Fisher adopted, where you had flotilla defense combined with a capital ship fleet and a battle fleet. I'm talking about navies which are entirely built around the idea of the Junicole. Does it make more sense today? Does it not? French cruisers are beautiful ships. They are well-balanced ships for the most part. But they take a long time to build. They often involve multiple ministers in the theoretically occupying the same post at every stage of the build. And to say the overall French force is muddled and that the treaties affect France possibly less than other nations, because at no point is France really building enough that it could actually has to worry about the treaties, is to put it mildly. France on paper has a humongous industrial capacity and have the capabilities that come from that. And in reality, they never get to implement that. They never do. Because it's just not viable for them to do so. They don't have the political consistency, the leadership, to be able to implement those. So not just every class, but almost every ship, every pair of ships represents some sort of evolution or complete revision in thought process. There is also the practical aspect, in that for France, the Navy is always a nice to have, not a must have. That's why you build those huge concrete fortifications on the borders. Because the Navy is the cruiser strategy, is the additional strategy, the extra form of an offensive that enables a continental power to threaten another state. But France at no point in the 1920s and 30s is really putting enough finances in there to threaten anyone. I would argue not even Italy. When we're talking about Italian cruiser policy, there is going to be a very quick discussion, which is basically going to be Italian cruisers especially their heavy cruisers and the way they cheat the treaties, are designed to kill their French counterparts. That is the very basis. They are not designed to fight the British. They're not designed to fight the forces that will overwhelm with numbers. They're designed to kill ships 1v1. And that is something we'll be getting into next week. And I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you will enjoy the Luigi wants to go to. And then we have the Kirovs coming, which is going to be fun. Live, well, currently there are two things on discussion. As mentioned earlier, the question for this week and the question for the comments is, do you think the June Nicole still lives? And if so, show me the navies which are still being run according to it. Entirely, not partially, not using the Fisher modifications, but entirely built around the June Nicole. Those were June. Fun. We have currently got live, there's a link again down below, to the comment, the post where you are allowed to put forward questions for 60 seconds. Please put forward questions for 60-second videos, which I will answer in 60 seconds. They will go up as the shorts, the questions from Naval History series. And next week we have Italian cruiser design and doctrine, which is going to have a live and a recorded video. But also we will have next week, from tomorrow, well, probably from Monday, going live Monday, will be a vote, the patron vote, to vote on the topics for patron 58 and patron 59, which is going to be fun. Take care, everyone. Hope you enjoyed, and thank you for watching. Take care.